talk about purpose. Why are you here? Why'd you come here again? It doesn't matter how many times you might have been here before. Are you concerned about such ideas such as past lives, future memories? Or are you actually centered here, right now? Are you actually present in the moment? Are you actually fully embodied where you are, who you are, understanding why you are? These aren't easy questions. And I think one of the better questions we can always ask throughout our everyday is it true? Applies to virtually every situation. Is that true? Is that even true? How could I verify that? Why would they say that? Why would I think that? Why am I feeling this way? Is it even true? But when we're talking about purpose, we're talking about things that were probably decided somewhere else at some other time, likely, pre-conception, before we got here, before we decided, perhaps on our parents, and perhaps even the time frame and the era in which we would be born. Things obviously happen quite differently in different eras and centuries and millennia in the human experience, as we know. We know bits and pieces of it through learning history. We learn a few more things here and there through, you could call them truth drops, through the books we read, the films we watch, the stories we hear and listen to. A lot of these things can help us derive and discern our purpose. And it's not necessarily likely that we'll know early on. We might have inclinations, we might have certain interests and passions. And of course, we might want to model and respect those who raised us and taught us and mentored us as when we are young. But we also might have this through line that starts early on and carries through, and then all the meandering that we do through life helps us when we're resonating with our fullest, truest selves. And in that moment, all of that up and down, left and right informs our path and informs our decision making along that path and helps us to get clear when we wander away from it, or when we're feeling disconnected, maligned, ineffective, frustrated, or like we're wasting time. For me, when I was young, I had certain visions and ideas in my head about being a musician, being a performer, being on a stage in front of a crowd singing my music. And that manifested in different ways. And also never really played out in the way I had envisioned as it showed up in those images when I was a child. There were different avenues, different paths and distractions and off-ramps and such that happened along the way that I wouldn't say deterred, but deferred, certainly delayed, distracted. And these are convenient excuses because that's the same for everyone. Life happens. And if we don't fully commit to one thing, to one purpose, we're going to very easily find excuses and scapegoats, people to blame, situations to blame, circumstances to blame. They are easily offered. If that's what we're looking for, we will most certainly find them, right? Energy flows where our attention goes. And if we're of the mind to find reasons not to challenge ourselves and to avoid doing things that are uncomfortable or unfamiliar, terrifying, or unknown, of course, because virtually everything is unknown until we go through the actions and start walking in the direction of what it is that we desire to experience and to achieve. The paths will diverge and converge. People will come into your life and catalyze certain moments and events. They will perhaps serve as reminders of what we actually, in our minds, should and could and would be doing if the situation was, perhaps ideal or different or better. And of course, that's another one of the pitfalls of excuse making and finding ways to justify delaying, deferring, and putting things off. And of course, that would be wonderful if the situation was always ideal, if things were perfect, if we had the perfect location, the right amount of money in the bank, the right people, the right support. We had champions and benefactors, people around us that would cheer us on, and all the rest of these things that we paint this vision board with in order to be able to achieve and to be the best that we can be, to be all that we can be. We look for those attributions and confirmations and affirmations, and they are rarely forthcoming, aren't they? And a lot of these things obviously affect us differently depending on our personality type, our life experience, and how we formed our character, and whether we are of a certain archetype, and how we pursue things in life, whether we're aggressive and bullheaded about things, or we're passive and considered, and we need to fully educate and prepare and prepare and prepare before we take even the first step. When we look at the grander picture of how life works, we can think and affirm and talk all we want, but until we actually start moving our avatar in the direction, taking whatever actions that we can that actually affirm to the universe, to the simulacrum, to this construct, whatever you want to call it, that affirms that we are actually intent on pursuing that. How can the path reveal itself, and how can we find any surety of foot unless we start walking? And I think it also confirms within ourselves when we are moving in that direction, when we start to walk and knowing that we're probably going to trip and fall, that we're going to have to try different ways, that we're going to have to keep learning as we go, learning as we grow, that we have to embrace both uncertainty and paradox. We have to rise above the clamor and the clatter and the noise of the mind, because that's always going to be there to some degree, and other people are going to infuse our stream of consciousness with their own doubts and worries and concerns based on their framework and what they value and prioritize. You might need to contend with all manner of opinions and ideas, and ultimately mix up that whole stew of information and decide for yourself what's going to work. And usually the best way to discern and figure that out is by going through the motions, at least beginning something, because at that point you initiate the chain reaction of what was only inertia or potentia, and then things start to move. They move within you, within your body, within your different levels of energy, within you spiritually, psychically, energetically, electrically. I mean, there's many different ways to perceive this whole process of pursuing our purpose. And I think in general, today we're quite cerebral and consider ourselves intellectual and informed. And therein lies a certain handicapping and limitation, self-imposed boundaries. Usually, of course, unconsciously. We don't realize we're doing it, but we, in effect, become our own worst enemies because we can outthink ourselves and cause unnecessary suffering, pain, agitation, frustration by thinking. Because thinking, as we know, is not wisdom. Thinking is not knowing. And the only way we get to knowing and to understanding and to wisdom is through moving in that direction. And through the tripping and the falling and the acquiring experience, we discern, we develop our intuition, and of course we develop the skills necessary in the field of our choice. Whether or not we go through sort of official training or education system or not. And for the most part, we're going to be autodidactic, and I think it's a requisite part of the process that we take it upon ourselves to assume that responsibility, because any external mentor, teacher, instructor, they have their own framework, perception, filters, perspective, motivations and reasons for teaching in the way they do, for laying out the ideas and the instructions and the curricula in the way that they do. And they can only hope that you are getting the most benefit out of what they're offering in the way that will serve you best. And then ultimately you have to take it in yourself. And, we're generally going to forget most of everything that we learn by rote, because it's simply that surface level, superficial kind of learning, as opposed to walking in those boots and going through the motions and screwing up 100,000 times. And slowly we chisel away and chip away at, as any good marble statue, you just the thing was in there already. The statue, the finished product, the idea is already in the rock. It was just a matter of chipping away the excess till you got down to what was always there inside. And I think in our society, in our culture today, we layer things on and pile things on and pile things on, and then we wonder why we're not feeling particularly enlightened and inspired. And so through life and through the process of walking in the shoes and walking our path and trying to discern more specifically what it is that we want to do, and these things will change. Our purpose might change dramatically throughout a life, right? You might start off with one intention, go through all sorts of shit, go through terrible relationships, whatever it is. You might have children, all sorts of factors that'll come into the picture that'll inform you and that process, and might completely change directions based on new information, right? A lot of people choose their careers based on some extreme events, some extreme traumas, some injury, whatever it might be, right? We see the coaches and therapists and psychiatrists and a lot of people that go into different fields for specific reasons based on, of course, their own history, perhaps their family history, and what they were most exposed to, and what guided them down a certain path, right?
Hello.
So the calamity and the crisis and the trauma and the struggle can, of course, become the catalyst that defines and designs our path. And that's beautiful. How clearer could it be that for now and maybe forever, that is your raison d'etre. And what will bring you most joy is satisfying that impetus, and then you'll see the reactions and the repercussions and the reverberations and how it affects and helps other people. And that is what else could you ask for, right? And then along the way, you'll probably have other information, more inputs, the experience that you'll gain, and you'll want to shift paths, alter your trajectory once again. Everything that you've learned from every aspect of life, from the most innocuous and strange experiences, will inform something that you're doing down the road. And it'll probably surprise you quite a bit. The things that you would think have nothing to do with anything and are just annoyances and wastes of time and take 1, 2, 10 years that seem to be pulling you further and further away from what the hell you feel you're supposed to be doing. And then suddenly it swings around and wow, I had no idea. Because there were certain elements, certain aspects perhaps of your character, your personality, your emotionality, your spirituality, what have you. Something about your foundation needed perhaps to be repaired or scaffolded more accurately, or completely rebuilt from the ground up, to be reformatted so that you had something even more solid and more resilient to stand upon, so that when you actually do pursue and step into your path, you have a different kind of confidence. You have a different kind of swagger, right? Because you've gone through all sorts of shit. You've survived assaults from culture, from the world around you that's constantly assaulting your senses, dependent on, how you live, where you live, and how you view the world, of course. But in general, there's kind of a negative bias to our world right now. And so a lot of us are having extreme difficulty contending with that, because there's different levels of assault, and that the inputs from that field can affect us all in different ways. And some of us have a very, very difficult time contending with that. So don't feel that you're alone. And don't feel that you need to keep it all to yourself. Find people that you can talk to and get these things off your chest and unburden and enlighten yourself, because you're simply, again, these are just layers and programs and conditions that are very likely not of your own creation, and you don't need to carry them for life, and you don't need to keep dragging them around you like some sort of fancy baggage that you might even consider that you need to impress people with, or that it's going to give you some sort of reward otherwise. Because look at me, look at the shit that I've survived. I'm a fucking martyr. I'm a fucking hero. Please. There will come a point where you're going to have to just let that shit go. and rise above. Because to be of better service to yourself and to humanity, you will realize and you will have to understand, and you'll probably summon that from somewhere deep inside you, that there are no victims here. And I've said this many times. Everyone's going to take that in a different way and going to have to discern for themselves what that means. To me, ultimately, it's empowering. It should be. And I've certainly had plenty of dark moments and struggles in this life with, the world, with myself, with the frustrations and the anxiety and the stress and trying to figure stuff out, and of course getting stuck up there. And of course, as I've already said, thinking is not knowing. Thinking is not wisdom. And in our culture, in our society, when we're looking at these two-dimensional representations and these screens, these flattened versions of life, they're not alive. They're representations, they're artifices, they're synthetic. So to get to the meat of things, you have to go back to at least 3D. You have to be using your eyes in nature, looking at people in their eyes, face to face, real debates, real conversations. And that'll bring you back to something that's real. That'll touch on something that's fundamental to your character, to your life process, to your evolving, unraveling, remembering. The fundamental truths underneath everything can only be discovered once we unburden and enlighten ourselves. And how to enlighten ourselves is simply to let go of the conditions and the terms and the offers and contracts that you may have either consciously or unconsciously agreed to, ascribed to, and signed up for. So living with purpose, on purpose, gives us that deeper meaning, and it allows us to live by our values, to live through our highest priorities. And how often do we slip and fall from that path, right? How often do we defer to someone else's values or take on someone else's priorities? Sometimes that's good. Many times it'll be necessary and perhaps even unavoidable. So be it. Find ways to integrate it into your path, into your purpose, into living your best and most full expression of who you are and why you came here. And like I said, there's plenty of ways to defer, plenty of ways to derive excuses, and plenty of ways to define scapegoats. And ultimately, that's lying to ourselves. And as we know, we cannot lie to ourselves because we know, we're aware, we're conscious, and we know when we're lying. And to try and maintain a lie takes an awful lot of work. And just as it is when you're lying to other people, you have to remember who you lied to, what you lied about, and why you lied about. And, are you going to keep maintaining that lie? So when it's trying to lie to yourself, it's impossible. It's a cycle that ensures an awful lot of pain and suffering, anxiety, stress, all the negative side of the emotional spectrum, as opposed to being truthful and authentic and genuine with yourself, warts and all kind of thing. Then of course you'll flip that polarity and you'll start working more on the positive side of the emotional, spiritual, psychic spectrum of energy, right? In its simplest form, it's electricity. Which side of the force and the field of energy you do want to be utilizing? Which one feels more fulfilling? Which one's more joyous? Which one is more loving, unified, harmonious, right? It's very easy to torture ourselves and to borrow ideas that are perpetuated in public consciousness that are self-defeating, self-denying, self-negating, because it's profitable, right? These endless therapies and self-help and remediation sort of ideas are billion-dollar industries, and they're that way for a reason. So there are ideas that perpetuate and proliferate and propagate through our societies that are quite anti-human, anti-life, and very unnatural. When we adopt those things, we can feel that something is off. We can adapt, we can try and heal and rebalance the energies, but ultimately it's taking an awful lot of time and energy away from simply being authentic, real, and true. So when we can get back to that, once again, We'll be able to open our eyes a little more brightly. We'll probably sleep a little better at night, and we'll more easily align with purpose. We'll feel the meaning. We'll re-enliven the spirit. We'll touch again on what is most powerful, poignant, prescient to our soul. And ideally, we'll just walk a little easier.